Growing up, I lived in a small town in a heavily forested area. Around second grade, my best friend, who I'll call Celia, began telling me about strange things happening in her house. The first thing she mentioned was a small hole forming in the walls of her unfinished basement. The walls were made of a brick or cinder block material, and the hole was forming in the mortar, expanding as if the bricks were crumbling. I remember asking Celia if her parents knew about it, and she said they weren't worried. Fast forward a few years to 4th or 5th grade, and the hole had only grown larger. We could now fit most of our arms into it, and as far as we reached, we couldn't feel the end. It kept corroding deeper into the house, but didn't get much bigger in diameter. Around this time, Celia started telling me she could hear voices coming from the basement, and she believed they were coming from the hole. I never heard any sounds when I visited, but since we were only 10 years old, I completely believed her. We often had sleepovers on the weekends, which is when I was usually exposed to all the creepy things happening in her house. Her family was kind of strange. They had an unusually large number of pets, at least 6 cats and dogs, plus rabbits, birds, lizards, snails, frogs, fish, etc. Around the time she started hearing voices, we noticed that her cats and dogs would randomly disappear, only to be found later in the basement, standing right in front of the hole. In all the years I'd known her, her animals had never liked being in the basement, so this started to scare us. Celia told me she believed something was living in the walls and could move around the house, with the hole being one of their exits. At the time, I believed her, but I hadn't seen enough to be as scared as she was. At school, she became an anxious wreck. The teachers and other students were really concerned about her, but it seemed like her parents didn't care or didn't believe her. A lot of adults thought she was just anxious because her much older sister had left for college. Now, here's where it gets really terrifying. I was sleeping over at her house during the Christmas holiday. A note about Celia's room. She had a huge collection of stuffed animals, clearly because of her family's love for animals. That first night, we went to sleep in her bed, and when we woke up the next morning, we immediately saw that every stuffed animal, which was usually scattered all over the room, was neatly arranged in a pile about 4 feet high. All the animals were facing us, staring right at us. Even now, I don't believe, and didn't believe at the time, that Celia or someone else could have moved all those toys. I've always been a light sleeper, and some of the animals had been on top of a large wardrobe. We both knew that whatever Celia believed to be living in the walls had to be responsible. We carefully put the animals back and never told her parents. I kind of wish we had now. Since I was staying the entire weekend, we went to bed again that night. We woke up sometime later, still in the dark. We heard a very low creaking noise coming from underneath us. We knew it was the wooden floor under her bed. Like in a textbook horror movie, and probably because we were only 10, we thought it would be a good idea to lean over the edge of the bed and look under. As soon as we looked, we saw and heard one of the floorboards slam back into place. We immediately shot back up, held each other, and cried. I've never been so scared in my life. The next morning, I called my parents to come get me, and I refused to go back to Celia's house. She only got worse at school, and I don't remember if I kept asking her about the strange things in her house. Maybe I was too scared, and we were just so young. My family moved far away from that town that summer for unrelated reasons, and I only saw Celia twice after that, over a decade ago. I haven't heard from her since, but I've always wondered what happened. I know her family still lives in that house today. It was the summer of 2015 when I moved in, and at first, my housemate and landlord Mike seemed somewhat normal, though socially awkward and dysfunctional. When I was signing the lease, he was adamant that I should never go into the basement, which I thought was odd. But I really needed a place to stay, and people have their quirks, so I just chalked it up to that at the time. As I got to know Mike, and our cohabitation continued, I learned more about the depths of his dysfunction. Firstly, that he used meth. Now, I don't automatically judge people based on their vices, but I was surprised at the extent of his use. He was probably the first person I knew who used meth while holding down a full-time job and enjoying a decent amount of success. The reason this is important to the story is that when he was home, drinking and using meth, he would start talking excessively. He would often joke that if I smelled lye coming from the basement, not to think anything of it. By the third time he said this, I asked why he kept saying it, and he replied with a wily grin, "I use chemicals to clean up after the bodies." I tried to chalk that up to a bad sense of humor, but it didn't sit right with me. He was also very particular about knowing my schedule, when I'd be home, when I was leaving. I remember him being shocked and uncomfortable one day when I took off work unexpectedly. He hadn't realized I was home. I recall that day because I heard a lot of clanging and what sounded like muffled shouting coming from the basement. His car was in the driveway, but he wasn't in the main house or his bedroom. Other times, he'd play very loud music or even NPR talk radio at high volumes, which, in retrospect, may have been to mask other sounds. He also made disturbing remarks about sex workers, saying things like, "You can do whatever you want. Choke them or beat them to death and nobody cares." I told him I thought that was messed up. But when he was tweaking, he'd circle back to those violent comments, talking about how he was a normal white guy with a house and a good job, so the police would never suspect him. At this point, I started to think it had gone too far to simply be a joke. I was in a tough spot, as money was tight and my options were few. I tried to convince myself that even if he was messed up, he was probably just fantasizing. I knew he hired sex workers occasionally, which I didn't judge, but I was starting to grow concerned. One day, while doing laundry, I caught the scent of decomposition. The house was in southeast Portland and relatively new. Having grown up in upstate New York, I knew animals could get trapped in walls and die. But this was the garage, and there were no signs of animals. The smell was strange and troubling. I decided to confront Mike about it. I expanded on his jokes and told him he needed to clean up the bodies better because I could smell decomposition from the garage. I'll never forget his reaction. His eyes widened, and he gave me a sharp glare, somewhere between fear and anger. He stumbled over his words before finally responding, "What? Really?" I said, "Yes, really." There were a few seconds of awkward silence before he said, "Thanks for letting me know," and promptly went into his bedroom and shut the door. A few days later, while I was doing laundry again, he went into the upper crawl space in the garage. He called for me, trying to convince me to come up there. My body locked up, and my instincts screamed at me not to go. I gave some excuse, I can barely remember what, and left quickly. Mike spent a lot of time in the basement, which had a padlocked door and no doorknob. The only way in was through the backyard. In retrospect, I wish I had gone down there, if only to confirm or dismiss my suspicions. In the last couple of months I lived there, his comments about women and sex workers became more graphic, with explicit talk of sexual violence. His meth use also increased. Once, he showed me a video he had made. He was a graphic designer and artist, which featured heavy bondage themes, distorted audio of women screaming, and a leering figure in a plague doctor costume. Any one of these things alone might seem innocuous, but together, they raised serious red flags. In October 2016, I finally left, taking off for the Ositi Oyate camp during the anti-pipeline protests with the Standing Rock Lakota. It was a mix of feeling called to action and wanting desperately to escape that house. I didn't give notice before leaving. My last night there, Mike was drinking and tweaking again, starting in on the same conversation, loosely describing murder and sexual violence under the guise of a joke. I told him that eventually he would get caught, no longer holding back my suspicions. He reiterated, with chilling seriousness, that he was the last person the police would suspect, and they wouldn't catch him. There was no pretense this time. I left the next morning. This haunted me for months, then years. The guilt of doing nothing ate away at me, so I eventually called Portland Crime Stoppers and submitted an anonymous tip describing everything I've told here. The operator kept putting me on hold because the story piqued the interest of the police sergeant at the call center. They asked me detailed questions about Mike's vehicle, house, and the methods he had described. It seemed like they were taking it seriously. I gave them as much information as I could remember and left it at that, feeling slightly better that I had tried to do something. Fast forward to recent times. I told my mother about everything, and she became curious. She looked up the house on Google Maps, and we noticed a large enclosed trailer in the driveway that wasn't there when I lived there. I could only theorize why it might be there, but I couldn't come up with a practical reason, unless he was moving or using it to discard things. Admittedly, that's pure conjecture, but I couldn't help but wonder. I doubt I'll ever get closure or validation of my suspicions unless Mike is caught and arrested. I've grown up poor and been around plenty of lowlifes and unsavory people, but none of them ever made the impression Mike did. About a year ago, for the month of June, my family went to France for 4 weeks and left me to tend to the house and take care of the animals. My house is in an interesting location, an hour from the campus where I go to school, a 30-minute drive from work, and 20 minutes from the main town. My neighbors and I have a few acres between us, and the closest house to me is a 10-minute drive away. My house is surrounded by farmers' fields, military property, and then miles and miles of BLM land, with mountains in the distance. Sometimes I feel like I live in the house from Courage the Cowardly Dog because of how isolated it is and the strange things that happen. If you Google what a 2-story house looks like, that's exactly what my house looks like. Except it's a 1-story. The second story, where all the windows are, is just ceiling space. There are also lofts where my landlord was planning to put a second story, but never got around to it. It's as if they tried to build a 2-story house but realized there was nowhere to put the stairwell. The house also has a large basement and an attic. I've lived here for 8 years and always felt the house had a strange layout. Next to my room, there's a huge wall that connects to the living room wall. But my room isn't as big as the wall, so there's just a large empty space between the living room and my room. Underneath my room are the stairs to the unfinished basement. Now that you understand the layout of my house, it makes sense that there are a lot of birds' nests on the roof. Birds congregate on top of the house during the summer, especially when bugs are out, and because we feed our cat just below. My room acts like a funnel for the noise of them scratching on the roof and running around. About 2 weeks after my family left for France, the birds started making their usual scratching noises on the roof. They did it every hour or so, all day and all night. It's a very unsettling sound to hear at 3 in the morning, and quite annoying. Then I started hearing scratching and banging sounds coming from the wall next to me, which made me think we had rats in the walls. My mom assured me over Skype that it was probably just birds on the roof, like usual. Over the next few days, I kept hearing the scratching noises and banging sounds coming from my wall. Finally, I decided it was time to check the closets and the basement for signs of mice or rats, so I could buy the proper traps. After checking the basement and finding no signs of mice, I went to check the hall closet, which is the only thing between my living room and my room. It's usually locked because it's full of yard tools, my stepdad's shotgun, my archery equipment, and a handgun. We keep it locked to prevent my youngest brother from injuring himself. I assumed it was locked, but I checked the handle anyway, and it opened. I thought maybe my stepdad had unlocked it before they left, just in case I needed a gun to protect myself. The first thing I noticed when I opened the closet was that all of the tools had been moved to the far side, and part of the closet wall was missing. At this point, I was freaking out and called my best friend and her dad to come over and check it out. I thought about calling the police, But since I live far from a lot of things, I figured discovering a hole in my closet wall wasn't enough to warrant a police visit. My best friend's dad and brother came over and used flashlights to look into the hole. They didn't see anything too strange, so my friend's dad got on his hands and knees and crawled inside. When he got out, he had a look of horror on his face. He told us that he found a dirty mattress, a pair of men's jeans, chicken feathers everywhere, and a partially eaten Walmart rotisserie chicken. He called the police, and they searched the whole house, but found no one and nothing else out of the ordinary. My friend's dad nailed a slab of wood over the hole, and I had all the locks changed. Since then, the creepy compartment in my closet has been sealed up. The scariest part is that because I work during the day and often leave the house unlocked, the guy living in there could have come and gone as he pleased until I got home at night. I have 8 dogs, which is why my family needs